Well, and
bottom
speaking
line,
of films, I was going to mention, a good side hobby you have is that I didn't know about is as film critic. You gave a fascinating film review of not the last Godzilla movie, but the one back in 2019 that was intriguing. Are there any particular films that stand out that were influential that you recommend to people that you like in that category?
Well, I'm not a huge Godzilla guy, but it's funny I mentioned Godzilla earlier. Now you bring it up. I guess I did. Well, that whole Godzilla movie was about eugenics, and it was about Atlantis, and it was about secret technology, and it was about how the globalists want to depopulate the Earth, and there's a secret group of rich people trying to trigger the end of human civilization to save the Earth. So this is Hollywood with an allegory of actually what the globalists are doing and what they're actually talking about doing. But I'll tell you, Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah,
I got a chance to know over the years, Vivian Kubrick was his protege and his favorite daughter, and she helped kind of co-direct and do the music on some of his last films. She told me a lot of what I'd already been told by people involved in the film, that it went specifically to the elite, specifically to pedophilia, that he was never involved in it, but he learned about it, being at the top of Hollywood, and he was very, very much against it. And he was also, understood about demon possession and things. That's what The Shining is basically about, or kind of interdimensional possession or fold space. And that the 25 minutes that was cut out is just devastating. And that he was probably killed. He had final cut, and so he was able to put out what he wanted, but he died. He died before that could be a release. They did cut the 24 minutes or 25 minutes or whatever it was. So it's fascinating talking to Vivian Kubrick about that.
Well, and I think you look at Kubrick's films, he's often taking real life stories and trying to get them out in a cinematic narrative way. You're talking about Dr. Strangelove, and that, what you uncovered and talk about frequently about Operation Northwoods, which people should just read that to see what our joint.
Oh yeah, for folks who don't know, you're good at this, Barnes. Why don't you describe the 1964 film that is Dr. Strangelove versus 1961 Operation Northwoods, and L.L. Lemonster and Curtis LeMay, the real Joint Chiefs of Staff, coming to Kennedy and saying, we're going to stage an attack on our own bases to launch a preemptive nuclear war on the Soviet Union. And then you find out that Dr. Strangelove is a real movie about what almost happened.
Precisely. because Operation Northwoods is shocking because it's the top of our military infrastructure signing off on massive false flag staged events throughout, and whether or not people would have
to lead to a controlled nuclear war, they believe was one of them.
George C. Scott was not a made-up character. He was someone that Kubrick connected people knew about. That was the mindset and the mentality of key people at the highest ranking of military. They thought they could, like when people.
And for folks that don't know, George C. Scott was L.L. Lemonster, and Curtis LeMay was Jack T. Ripper.
Exactly.
Well, you're all operating on the basis that people have seen Dr. Strangelove. Go watch it. It's an absolute classic. But Operation Northwoods, you have to explain what it is to anybody out there who may not know, because this would be one of those theories that you would never believe. And once you understand that it didn't just occur, it's reality. If you ever go back to not questioning the government, I would question your judgment. The only difference is how far do you go in that, and whether or not it creates a trauma whereby you question everything, including whether or not water is good for you. But Robert, Alex, whichever one of you, explain what Operation Northwoods was. And it's going to lead to my next question. The three biggest conspiracy theories that have turned out to be undeniable, demonstrable fact that would blow people's minds.
Well, Robert, you brought up Northwoods. You kind of set the table here, and then I'll just add a few points.
Sure. So, I was introduced to it by you. And I remember when I first heard it, thought, I can't believe that's fully the case. There must be some hyperbole, exaggeration, etc. But you understated it. I was reading the documents and I was like, holy cow. Because of who, this wasn't some low-level CIA analyst hanging out with Alan Dulles doing some sort of idea plot. This was the highest ranking of the U.S. military, all signing off, all demanding the president of the United States sign off to lie to the American people that they're going to false flag staged events, hijack airplanes, have boats sink, have terrorist events occur. They purportedly were not going to kill any Americans, but they were going to lead all Americans to believe that Americans had been killed and then use it to justify an invasion of Cuba, even if it meant another nuclear war, because they were actually gaming out how they could win another nuclear war. And so it's insane material. And the only thing that stopped it was John Kennedy. And then
John
John
F.
Kennedy was
Kennedy.
dead about a year later.
So, and I've had this discussion with very intelligent people, and I said, this is all provable, demonstrable, known fact right now. And the response was, well, it didn't pass. And I was like, who signed off on this at the Department of Defense? But for the only person who signed off, as in didn't allow it to pass, and whether or not that had any role to play in what happened a year later, one will never know. But the timing is what the timing was. But who signed off on this at the highest levels?
It was the Joint Chief of Staff.
All right, well, since L.L. Lemnitzer was the chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Curtis LeMay, they greenlit it. They brought it as a action plan that they recommended right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so let me lay this out. And let me go ahead and just reveal this here. Usually modern intelligence operatives are just analysts, or they're, former Green Beret types, okay? And things used to be human intelligence and signals intelligence before the NSA and computers took over in the late 90s. So before it was like, how big could the Soviet Union's human intelligence, HUMAT army be? How big could the US human intelligence army be? But things went to digital and signals by the 90s. And so you didn't get half of it being on signals and then half of it on HUMAT. It's 90% on signals now. So usually people think, oh, the intelligence agencies know all this special stuff. They don't know anything nowadays. It's the corporations that have access to all the NSA spy grids and big tech that have even more power than the NSA that are spying on people. And it's these corporate systems that are removing all the power to themselves, and the intelligence agencies have almost become vestigial. They're just a revolving door of big tech telecom executives that, make money when they're in the private sector, but with all their back doors and control into the NSA and into the other 16 agencies that they've transferred power to, than all the other agencies and systems. But globally, it's the telecoms themselves and the internet backbone that is the surveillance grid. The internet itself is a two-way system, just like TV used to watch TV because it's broadcast. Well, now TV watches you. And so with that preface, you go back to those days, though, you needed big events, big catalyzing events, and a lot of spycraft was theater. A lot of spycraft was deception. You go back to World War II, they would have a dead body, dress it up in a British uniform, and then have plans on it. They'd throw the dead bodies out in the ocean, hoping the Germans found the dead bodies, hoping the Germans found the plans, and actually out of however many dead bodies they threw out, they did find one dead body, and they won a major naval engagement, all because the Germans found that one dead body. So false flags simply go back to, thousands of years ago, but the British coined the term in the wars with the French, where they would run up their French flag, even though it was the British, and they would commit an atrocity and blame it on the French. And it was all, how much were your men willing to do? You'd pull over some normal vessel and kill everybody on board. The British were famous for it. The French did it some, but not as much as the British. And you would do a barbarous atrocity and blame it on the French. So that's where the term false flag comes from. And there's many, 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 many cases of this. And it's a dirty pool game that goes on. So I later learned from a former major ABC news producer a few years ago before he died. I'm not allowed to say his name because it's off record, but I did interview the guy. I'm not going to say who it is. That he'd been in the NSA, that there was no secret about that. He'd been a Nightline producer. And they knew about Northwoods. They knew it had been done. They knew that the attaché of L.L. Lemnitzer was Donald Rumsfeld, who'd become the youngest Secretary of Defense ever when Kennedy fired Lemnitzer. A few years later, Nixon gets in after LBJ, and you get Donald Rumsfeld, who just died last week, who later became Secretary of Defense yet again under George W. Bush. So in 2000. And so long story short, the good people in the NSA knew about those documents, knew who was inside the National Archives of the NSA, knew how to ask for something that wasn't completely classified so someone could slip that in there. And so this is WikiLeaks, proto-WikiLeaks. This is early WikiLeaks type stuff.
It's paper leaks.
It's paper leaks. So they were so worried because they read Rebuilding America's Defenses that was put out April 2nd, 2000, if I remember correctly. And in Rebuilding America's Defenses, Pax Americana, Cheney says, we're going to stage a new Pearl Harbor event. and we're going to invade and take over the world in the grand chessboard. In the middle of the board is Afghanistan, and we're going to legitimize race-specific bioweapons. We're going to have a bioweapon war. We're going to take over the planet. And people got so scared by that, knowing that Cheney had worked for his boss, Rumsfeld, who'd worked for L.L. Emdenser, that they got scared and they leaked Operation Northwoods, which was a U.S. government greenlit plan to stage mass shootings at shopping malls and movie theaters, bomb U.S. military bases in the U.S., actually wound and kill people. Then they were going to have a plane with CIA families who they were going to say died, change their names, get on a plane that would take off in Miami with cameras on it, saying it was on a delegation to Cuba. They would blow the plane up, but really divert that plane, have another plane with the same tail number, blow up, and then have footage of the parts on the shore of Cuba as a pretext to then attack Cuba. They believe the Russians would then fire missiles at the U.S., and then they would already have B-52s in the air ready to nuke Russia and win that nuclear war. And that's what Dr. Strangelove, famous Stanley Kubrick film with Peter Sellers, his greatest work, in my opinion, is based on. And so then once you know that, they go, okay, we didn't get to do Operation Northwoods, so they then do Operation 9/11 later. And that's where, it doesn't mean radical Muslims don't exist. Doesn't mean there weren't even real hijackers who thought they were part of an operation, but there was the stand down, the blowing up of Building 7, all the intelligence operatives, the airlift of evil, the flight school training being protected. And it all goes back to that pet project, that thesis that Donald Rumsfeld saw at the feet of L.L. Emdenser and Curtis LeMay.
And let's just put a big fat asterisk there so that nobody's misinformed or confused. This is your opinion, Alex, of contextualizing and putting into the historical context of what was actually Project Northwoods, and anybody can look it up. I heard about it on Joe Rogan, but I don't think it was through you, Alex, and it definitely wasn't through. This was a few years ago where I was like finally having my perspective, my horizons expanded. So this is where you get into your historical understanding and contextualizing in the current times to interpret the way you think things are going down presently based on the past. And you got in trouble for this. We don't need to get you back in trouble, although I don't know how much more trouble you can get in as to what happened once you started espousing publicly this view. But putting that on ice for a second, give us another good historical example of something that nobody would believe, but for the fact that it's documented truth now.
No one would believe, but it's documented proof now. I mean, the animal human cloning, which again, they kill them at the embryonic level. They're not like walking around from what we know. That's a big one. People wouldn't believe that if you read deeper into Tuskegee, they didn't just let black men spread syphilis over 40 years. Turns out the evidence was they were injecting them with it. They were doing it to poor whites in Appalachia. But once it came out, they're like, oh, it's just the blacks, using institutional racism to say that was okay, which proves that was definitely going on. Racism. How about reparations? How about paying those family reparations? I think they should. Because those are living victims and their families. And man, I tell you,
well, I brought up Gulf of
in the 1950s, they had a secret nuclear reactor already powering part of Southern California, a major saltwater reactor that blew up. They kept it secret till the 1990s, and it was bigger than Chernobyl. I mean, that's an example. There's just thousands and thousands of stories out there. I mean, here's one. The Finders. Ted Gunderson was the head FBI agent in Southern California. He was on the short list to replace J. Edgar Hoover. He apologized on my show. He helped run COINTELPRO. He arrested Martin Luther King. But he repented of it later. He was a good guy. He thought he was fighting communists. And he on my show 20 years ago, he died of bladder cancer like 8 years ago. Great guy, true American hero. He told me all this stuff about the Finders and a CIA base in D.C. and kidnapped children, and how good FBI agents found out about it in Florida with a bunch of kidnapped kids, and how they busted in, and there was all the child porn and satellite uplinks and videos of kids being killed. That all actually came out in D.C. newspapers, but then it all got shut down. And then 2 years ago, they actually declassified, the FBI did, several thousand pages on Twitter of the Finders, and stuff Ted Gunderson told me 25 years ago at dinner. He wouldn't even say this stuff on air. about whole towns taken over by Satanists and breeder farms of women breeding children for human sacrifice. And all of that got put out in that FBI data dump. And that's in the FBI data dump, and no one even cared or touched it. So if people think Nexium cult's big or they think Jeffrey Epstein's big, that's the tip of the iceberg, folks. I mean, this stuff is just insane.